My name's Andy Brown. I'm Vice Chair of Ørsted, President of the Energy Institute, but also 35 years in Shell. It's great to be able to spend some time talking with you and debating with you about how we can enable a just energy transition. We all know the world is running out of carbon budget if we're going to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And we all know that energy is the main contributor to greenhouse gases. So I left Shell 5 years ago, and I've been tussling with this issue about how can we help enable this just energy transition. And I'm sure all of you actually have been doing the same. So I wanted to share some of my experiences in those 5 years, some of my perspectives. And I'm actually also going to have some conclusions I've come to. I'm going to talk about how good governance is so important, how government needs to also invest in infrastructure, but also that how we need to promote technology and collaboration. And lastly, I want to just talk a bit about education and societal acceptance of the changes we're going to have to go through. But I'll come to that later. So I had 35 years in Shell. I lived in 7 countries. I have a very understanding wife. But I left in 2019. And that last 7 years, I was on the executive committee of Shell as the Upstream International Director and then the Upstream Director. So when it comes to the energy transition, I come from the dark side. But in that 7 years, I spent actually months working with the executive committee under Ben van Beurden, talking about the energy transition and how companies and how Shell will need to transition and the ways that we'll need to transition. So when I left Shell, and I think a lot of you that have been in executive roles also would have felt the same, you feel you've got a lot of experience, you've got a lot of expertise you'd like to share. But without executive role, it's very difficult to share it. And the alumni network is a great network where people can bring their experiences and have, I think, really good discussions about what the future holds. And when I left Shell, you've kind of fallen off a cliff a bit, I guess. But, being middle-aged, white, male, ex-oil executive, you're not on the first of the recruiters' lists. And for the first year, I was very conventional. I was a senior advisor to McKinsey. I was Vice Chair of SBM. I did actually have a real interest in hydrogen, so I did invest, and I was an advisor to a hydrogen fuel cell aviation startup called ZeroAvia. But more about ZeroAvia later. But really, my journey really set off when I got a phone call from a headhunter who basically asked me, do I want to be a CEO of an integrated energy company in Europe? And I said, no, not really. I don't want to move again. He then said it's in Portugal, and he also said it's a company that wants to drive the energy transition very fast. And those last 2 points meant that I was keen to go and be the CEO of Galp. Some of you will have heard of Galp, Portuguese company. And so with a real mandate to transition this company through the energy transition. Now Galp is like a Shell, a 20th the size. It has a big retail network, had 2 refineries at the time. It has a great upstream business in Brazil, in Angola, LNG position in Mozambique, big trading position across Iberia, but also a growing renewable portfolio. It had 1 gigawatt of solar and had this ambition to grow its green energy credentials. And so I set about, doing what I could to help transform this company. And it's interesting, going from Shell to what is a small company, still 8,000 people, it was amazing if you have clear resolve how quickly you can go. So we set a purpose, let's regenerate the future, and we doubled the renewable portfolio. We launched a 100 megawatt electrolyzer, so for green hydrogen for the refinery in Sines. Actually, at the time, the second largest electrolyzer in Europe when it was launched. We launched an HVO project, 240 kilotons, and we set up a joint venture with Northvolt for a lithium conversion facility. And we did all that in just 20 months. And we did it because what you learn from working in Shell is how you can unlock talent and the potential of the people. And through really engaging them and giving them this purpose, it was extraordinary how much could be achieved. And of course, when I started that in early 2021, it was the heady days of renewable energy company valuation. And at one point, Ørsted value was higher than BP's. So it gave a sense how the whole world, through COVID, was wanting to focus on the sustainability of our businesses and the energy transition. And for me, that was a moment where we saw real progress. It was quite quickly followed by the invasion of Ukraine from Russia. And sustainability was replaced with energy security, but both of them were attributes that you could match with renewable energy and homegrown renewable energy. And the European Union, through Fit for 55 and other regulation, was driving hard for this transition to happen. I only did 2 years in Galp, but at the end of that, unfortunately, the third area of affordability became much more pressing. Government had run out of money through the COVID and through supporting energy prices, and they were more interested in windfall taxes than they were in supporting sustainable businesses. And so leaving Galp, I could see how much progress you could make with the right tailwinds in the energy transition. But I was still very keen to think about where else I could contribute. And really the poster child of the energy transition companies is Ørsted. So Ørsted was a conventional oil and gas company, is now almost exclusively of an offshore wind with some onshore wind portfolio. It is a company that really has reinvented itself. And so an offshore wind is quite closely akin to the oil and gas business. Offshore wind is at the core of the UK's energy strategy. So to be able to join the board of Ørsted was a real dream and an opportunity really to get deep into renewable energy from that governance standpoint. And as I entered that business in early 2023, it soon became clear that the offshore business was in distress. It had a business for decades where costs had been coming down, where interest rates had been very low, how you could actually then sell on positions and retain value for yourselves and therefore get double-digit returns from these offshore wind projects. And what was happening there with the higher interest rates, but also inflation and a really distressed supply chain, was developers were struggling because they'd never seen costs go up. What amplifies how difficult that situation was the lead time between getting a fixed price for electricity and when the project started to be built, the FID moment. And in America, because of the permitting, that took 5 years. And as we all know, in 5 years, a lot can happen. And between the end of 2021 and the middle of 2024, the cost of installing offshore wind has almost gone up 50%. So you can imagine when you're in that situation and an offshore wind developer, what you thought was a good contract no longer is. And as a result, Ørsted had this massive write-off, $4 billion write-off. And being on the board, that felt kind of uncomfortable, as you might imagine. But it was to get a little more uncomfortable when the COO and the CFO basically left the executive committee. And I was asked to go in as the interim COO to try and stabilize the ship. So for the third time, I went back to work, working 60 hours a week. So I was brought in to steer the ship and stabilize the operations. And it's very interesting at this moment how much we've learned how to manage a cycle in the oil and gas business. And we looked and we revised the project operating model. We put in commitment control. We put in stage gates. We put in safety leadership, but also supply chain management in a way that I think Ørsted is in a much more stable place. And at the same time, we were still investing in new projects. Hornsea 3, which was launched in December last year, is 3 gigawatts of offshore wind energy. It's a project that will cost £8 billion to build. And I just, as an engineer, I just want to kind of give you an impression of what these offshore wind turbines are like. They're almost the height of the Eiffel Tower. Each blade is 115 meters long, longer than a football pitch, each blade. The nacelles where the turbine sits weigh 700 tons. The monopiles weigh 2,000 or 3,000 tons. This is enormous engineering. And Hornsea 3 needs almost 200 of these Eiffel Towers. So launching that project kind of was a moment, was one of the kind of biggest FIDs I've ever launched, even in my Shell career. And combined with Hornsea 4, where they've just won in allocation round 6 in the UK for a 2.0 gigawatt project, 350 Eiffel Tower structures that will have such an impact on the UK's energy. And you know, the enormous scale of those projects, you know, I think is something that, you know, really I find impressive. And I think, you know, Ørsted is back on track. One of the reasons I joined the Ørsted board is because they were looking also at renewable fuels. And soon after, I went back as vice chair on the board. And soon after that, the flagship 1 project was abandoned in mid-construction. This is an e-methanol project. It was an opportunity. It was the largest e-methanol project being built in Europe. Because the regulation isn't in place, because the shippers are not prepared to pay the premium for the green fuels yet, the project wasn't viable, although it was past FID. And so, you know, I think at this moment it was very clear that the regulation was not in place that was supporting these businesses that are so fundamental to our energy future. And if I kind of reflect on the risks that Ørsted and other renewable developers are taking, they are high. And I think the regulation is not fully supporting that. And if I think about those 3 years until now, Ørsted's value has declined by 65%. Shell's value has increased by 65%. So something is not right in terms of the investment signals that are being sent. So not only did I feel the governments weren't pushing as hard as they were at the end of 2021, 2022, but I also felt that the ESG parts of the pension funds, I also felt that people in general were not putting the priority on that they could do and I think should do. And so regulation, and good regulation, is going to be core for this business to grow. And what I also was kind of conscious of is, you know, how can we have a broader voice on this in society? And so I joined the Energy Institute and I joined the council. And this July, I was made the president of the Energy Institute. Some of you may not be aware of the Institute, but it's a global professional chartered body for people in engineering. So it charters engineers. It is, I think, a remarkable institute. It actually has enormous convening power. It has members, 20,000 members, 2,000 companies. 200 companies are members. And they bring renewable companies together with oil and gas companies. They send out every week a publication, a best practice publication. They have a very good magazine, New Energy World. But they work through a number of levers. They work through an academy to equip future generation for the energy transition. They bring people together to help inform decision makers, and they also help industry and individuals understand what the right energy choices are. So the Energy Institute was a body I could really align with and affiliate with. And if you're not a member, you should become a member. It's a bit of a pitch. One of the things the Energy Institute does do, it actually issues what's called the Statistical Review of World Energy. BP used to issue it. Energy Institute does that now. And in June this year, when we presented the results of that, it's clear that we are not yet going through a transition. No energy source declined. Everything got bigger. Now, admittedly, solar and wind went up 16%, but 63% of that was in China. But also fossil fuels up 1.5%. Coal up 1.6%, okay, admittedly on a China recovery. And greenhouse gas emissions are up 2%, so over 40 gigatons of CO2 from energy sources in 2023. Look at India. India consumed more coal than Europe and America put together. So there's a lot of work to be done. But what I also find interesting, we can be very pessimistic about this, but there's a lot of investment in new energies. It's estimated this year there could be almost 2 trillion invested in the new energy space, and about 1 trillion into conventional, so almost 3 trillion investments in energy in total. So we're growing our investment in renewables, but we haven't started the transition yet. So, what are we going to do? I think one of the things we have to do is realize this transition is going to cost money. And, sometimes you hear, well, wind and solar are now cheaper than fossil fuels, so, your bills will be cheaper. It is true, wind and solar is cheap. But the trouble is integrating it into our system is not. We will need to invest massively in things like stationary batteries. Stationary batteries at the moment are growing at 30% a year. But also we're going to have to invest massively in grid infrastructure. So I think we should avoid this kind of temptation to say, well, the future not only is going to be green, it's going to be cheaper. To actually re-engineer our system is going to be more expensive. And I think we've really got to kind of understand that. And we've got to understand that this is actually a 4-step journey. Step 1 is to make our electricity green. And we're on track, and the UK talks about 2030 having that target, but that's only step 1. Then we've got to have electrify everything. Yeah, so today there's only about 20% of the world's energy is delivered through electricity. In Europe it's more like a third. But we're going to have to electrify everything from transport to industry to heat pumps in the home. So that's the second thing we have to do. But thirdly, we're going to have to make sure this also happens in the developing world. It isn't happening at all in the developing world in some places at the moment. So that whole transition also has to take place there. And then fourthly, if we get our energy, about 50% of our energy from electricity, which is about far as we can get, the rest has to be decarbonised. We need renewable fuels, we need biofuels. So that whole system will need re-engineering and will cost a lot of money. And so somehow governments, public, everyone is actually going to have to appreciate that this is going to be a tough journey over several decades to get to an endpoint that may well be cheaper eventually, but the transition, the re-engineering transition, will not be cheap. So what are my points of advice? The first point is we need to have good governance from the governments, but also government investment in infrastructure. And if we look at regulation across the world, we have, a quilt of different ways that governments go through regulation. In America, you have more of a carrot. You have tax credits, you have $3 a kilogram for hydrogen production. But, you also have a very complex regulatory situation and a very difficult political situation. In Europe, I think they've used the stick. Through RED 2, RED 3, they've put a number of mandates in place to be achieved by certain dates, with 2030 being an important one. But these mandates are very convoluted, very difficult to understand what you need to achieve. And we'll come back on how to use the stick and when to use it. The UK, I think, has done pretty well. The CFD framework is a good one. It gives investors a reliable revenue stream to invest against. And for a lowly capitalized business looking to raise capital, that's important. Of China, of course, which actually moves faster than anyone else in renewable energy, ironically, is just state planned and controlled. So perhaps that's the best one. I'm not advocating that, but clearly that has shown a lot of progress. But, regulation is not just incentives or penalties. It's also, do we allow China sourcing? Are we going to have an energy system of the future reliant on China? And clearly with solar and batteries, we're already there. For me, obviously, in Ørsted, what happens to offshore wind? Do we go to China for sourcing? It's now European delivered. So these are all important parts of this regulatory framework that has to be clear and has to be very stable. And if you look at some of the examples in Europe with the stick, I think a big example at the moment is that 22% of EVs need to be, of cars need to be EVs in 2024, and we're only at 17%. And what it says in the rules is every internal combustion engine vehicle you sell that doesn't meet your quota you'll have a €15,000 penalty. Now, will the European Union do that? Will they undermine the core automotive manufacturing core of the continent? And so it's a real issue, because if you do use the stick, you'll damage business. If you don't use the stick, no one's going to believe you for the future targets. And we've got these RFNBO, renewable fuels for non-biological origin targets, 1% for transport fuels for 2030, but with 2 times multipliers. It's so complex and it's very difficult to navigate. So I do think we do need better regulation, and we do need very clear incentives and support. Again, the UK probably a model of success there. But also, governments need to invest in infrastructure. There are too many scenarios where we have a chicken and egg situation. I had that in Galp. There are not enough EV recharging points to give people the confidence to buy an electric vehicle and not have range anxiety. But it's a chicken and egg. Utilization is very low, below 10% for EV charging points. So investing in infrastructure is difficult. If you look at the electricity system of the UK and Europe, it's based on gas prices and CO2 prices. It's not a stable framework for people to make billions of dollars of long-term investment. So we really need to think through the regulation that will support the investments and will rebalance renewable energy companies with oil and gas companies in terms of attractiveness. But governments need to also invest in innovation. My second point, innovation and collaboration. You know, the IEA says that 35% of the technology or of the mitigation of CO2 for 2050 is from technologies that haven't yet been fully developed and proven. And I'll come back to ZeroAvia, because that for me also is a great example of a technology company doing its best, but with enormous challenges. So ZeroAvia has raised over $500 million in its financing rounds. And why? Because it's reinventing itself, the aircraft. It is reinventing for high temperature, compact PEM fuel cells, compact motors and inverters, heat management systems, the avionics, the certification, airworthiness certification, the mobile hydrogen trucks they've designed, the storage of hydrogen on the planes. But they're flying a 20-seater, 600 kilowatt motor and propeller. They're moving to 2 to 5 megawatts, liquid hydrogen this time, which hopefully by 2028 they will have commercialized. But I look at that, and they are having to do all of that technology themselves. You know, I tried to get Shell involved in this. There was some money forthcoming in the early stages, but they need a company like Shell to do the refueling. But it's so distributed, it's so low volume, it's not interesting. Again, a chicken and egg situation. But this again is somewhere where governments can step up and really show some leadership. So these technologies need an enormous amount of re-engineering. The whole energy system needs re-engineering, and that needs support. I was quite intrigued in the Energy Institute. We hosted the UK Atomic Energy Authority. The CEO, Ian Chapman, gave an amazing presentation on fusion, on the future of fusion, bringing what happens in the sun to Earth in these plasmas. He's managing to react at 150 million degrees C, 10 times hotter than the sun. But also with magnets that are so large they could pick up an aircraft carrier. And the vacuum in those magnets is absolute, and the temperature is 4 Kelvin. So the technology is extraordinary. The government's supporting it. And as some of you will know, we're building a grid-scale fusion reactor in West Burton. But it needs investment. It needs also collaboration. Because what was interesting, what Sir Ian said, but he wants to talk to the aviation business about high temperatures because of obviously the metallurgy of these reactors. He wants to talk to the space industry about the vacuums. He wants to talk to the oil and gas business about the balance of plant around the fusion reactors. Collaboration is important. My experience with Ørsted is bringing some expertise from oil and gas help stabilize their project delivery. So collaboration is going to be a crucial part of that future, as well as the investment in innovation that we need for the energy transition. And then I come to my last point, because you can have all the regulation, you can have all the innovation, but if society doesn't accept the solution, you're lost. Societal acceptance and education of the public at large is absolutely crucial. That's everything from the trust in the EV networks. That's everything from trust in hydrogen pipelines or CO2 pipelines, or understanding why we do need to build more renewable energy in the countryside. We will need pylons to take the energy from one place to the other. The investment in that infrastructure is going to be enormous. Just one fact. So Bloomberg NEF predicts that to get to net zero 2050, we need to spend $21 trillion on the grid infrastructure. That's $1 trillion a year, almost. That's more than oil and gas investments a year, just on grid infrastructure. So understanding what it's going to take to get there and educating the public large is absolutely crucial. And of course, I haven't talked about the biggest lever, and that is energy efficiency and teaching people how to be energy aware. I mean, the Energy Institute has a great application called Energy Aware. It's helping industries, it's helping individuals on trying to understand how best to manage their energy footprint. And if you look at the BP Energy Outlook, it'll say the GDP will double, let's hope, by 2050, which means that to get to net zero, we're going to have to improve our energy efficiency by 3% a year. That's much, much more than we've done in the past. So educating people how to be energy efficient is going to be crucial. All of you can be part of that journey. All of you can participate in that education and in driving efficiency, but also driving collaboration across industries. Also, where you can, supporting governments to make good regulation. Because if we don't do this, we're not going to have a just energy transition, and we will have climate impacts that we may learn to regret. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the conference. Thank you.